This is the story of every American aircraft that took to the skies during World War II. From nimble fighters to massive bombers, from vital transports to early drones, each aircraft had its mission, and some left an indelible mark on history. Join us as we explore their role in the greatest air war ever fought. Fighters and Interceptors. The Bell P-39 Airacobra featured a truly revolutionary design. Its engine was mounted behind the pilot, allowing a massive 37mm cannon to fire directly through the propeller hub. Developed in 1938 and entering service in 1941, this unconventional layout promised devastating firepower. American pilots found it disappointing at high altitudes over Europe, where its performance fell short against German fighters. But in Soviet hands, the Airacobra became a legend. Flying low over the Eastern Front, Soviet pilots exploited its strengths, turning it into one of their most successful fighters. The Red Air Force received over half of all Airacobras produced, and their aces swore by it. Next up, the Boeing P-26 Peashooter. This little fighter was America's last link to a bygone era, an open cockpit, fixed landing gear, and fabric-covered wings harking back to World War I designs. First flown in 1932, it represented the Army Air Corps' first all-metal monoplane fighter. By 1941, it was hopelessly obsolete, outclassed by modern designs in every measure. Yet, when the Japanese struck the Philippines in December 1941, Filipino and American pilots climbed into their Peashooters and fought with desperate courage, knowing they were flying museum pieces against Zeros. The Brewster F-2A Buffalo holds the unfortunate distinction of being the U.S. Navy's first monoplane fighter and one of its biggest disappointments. Entering service in 1939, it was already showing its limitations by Pearl Harbor. Pudgy, underpowered, and lacking maneuverability, it was brutally outmatched by the Japanese Zero in the Pacific. At the Battle of Midway, Marine Buffalo pilots suffered catastrophic losses. Yet, there's a remarkable footnote to this story. Finnish pilots flying Buffaloes against the Soviets achieved incredible success, proving that in the right hands and circumstances, even a mediocre aircraft could excel. Moving on, the Curtiss P-36 Hawk represented an important stepping stone in American fighter development. First flying in 1935, it was a clean, modern monoplane design that helped transition the Army Air Corps away from biplanes. The French Armée de l'Air operated it extensively during the Battle of France in 1940, where it proved capable against German aircraft. For the Americans, it was already being replaced by more advanced designs when war came, relegated mostly to training and colonial defense duties in places like Hawaii and the Philippines. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk became the workhorse American fighter of the early war years. Developed from the P-36 in 1938, it was rugged, dependable, and available in numbers when America desperately needed fighters. Its Allison engine limited high-altitude performance, but down low it could hold its own. The shark-mouthed P-40s of the Flying Tigers became legendary, defending China against Japanese aggression. Pilots learned to use its strengths, diving speed and durability, while avoiding turning dogfights where more agile opponents held the advantage. It served on every front, bought crucial time, and helped train the generation of pilots who would later fly more advanced types. Next up, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. This stubby, barrel-shaped fighter was the U.S. Navy's frontline carrier fighter when war exploded across the Pacific. First flown in 1937 and entering service in 1940, it was slower and less maneuverable than the vaunted Zero, but it compensated with incredible toughness. Grumman built it like a tank. Pilots brought shot-up Wildcats back to carriers when any other aircraft would have fallen into the sea. At Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, Wildcat pilots fought against overwhelming odds, developing tactics that exploited their aircraft's strengths. They took punishment, kept flying, and held the line until better fighters arrived. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was that better fighter. Designed with combat lessons learned from the Wildcat, it first flew in 1942 and entered service in early 1943. Everything about it was optimized to kill the Zero: speed, firepower, protection, and high-altitude performance.
The results speak for themselves. Hellcats achieved a staggering 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. The Lockheed P-322 Lightning was an interesting footnote, a stripped-down export version of the P-38, originally intended for Britain and France. Without turbochargers and fitted with different propellers, it couldn't match the P-38's high-altitude performance. After France fell in 1940, these aircraft were retained by the U.S. but proved unsuitable for combat. They served as advanced trainers, preparing pilots for the real Lightning's demanding characteristics.
Next up, the North American P-51 Mustang. Many consider it the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. The story of how it came to be is remarkable. Designed, built, and first flown in just 117 days in 1940 to meet a British requirement. Early versions with Allison engines were good but not exceptional. Then came the transformative moment, fitting it with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything else. By 1944, Mustangs were escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something previously thought impossible. They hunted German fighters across the length and breadth of the Reich, finally giving American bombers the protection they desperately needed. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was America's first purpose-built, radar-equipped night fighter. This large, twin-boom aircraft first flew in 1942 and entered service in 1944. With a three-man crew, pilot, radar operator, and gunner, it prowled the night skies, hunting enemy bombers and intruders. Its powerful radar could detect aircraft at several miles distance. In both the European and Pacific theaters, Black Widows protected Allied forces from nocturnal attack, proving that darkness no longer provided sanctuary. Moving on, the Republic P-35 was an important transitional design from aviation pioneer Alexander Seversky. First flying in 1935, it was an early all-metal monoplane that helped the Army Air Corps move into the modern era. Though it saw limited combat service, mostly in the Philippines during the desperate early days, it provided invaluable experience and paved the way for Republic's later masterpiece, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Republic P-43 Lancer was another stepping stone, serving as a high-altitude interim fighter. Developed in 1940, many were shipped to China, where they provided valuable service alongside Flying Tiger P-40s until more modern types arrived. It was a capable aircraft for its time, though quickly surpassed by rapid wartime development. Next up, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug. This massive fighter was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. First flying in 1941 and entering service in 1942, it seemed too big, too heavy to dogfight, but pilots discovered its incredible strength, devastating in a dive, capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage, and armed with 8 .50 caliber machine guns that could tear anything apart. As a high-altitude escort, it protected bombers over Europe. As a ground attack aircraft, it became perhaps the most feared Allied weapon. Pilots called themselves jug drivers and hunted German armor and trains with rockets and bombs. The Seversky P-35 was essentially an earlier designation that preceded the Republic P-35. Alexander Seversky's company produced this innovative pre-war design that helped American military aviation transition to modern monoplane fighters. Though it served only briefly before being replaced, it represented crucial progress. The Vought F-4U Corsair was nicknamed Whistling Death by the Japanese, who learned to fear its distinctive sound. That inverted go-wing design served a specific purpose. It allowed clearance for the massive propeller while keeping the landing gear relatively short. First flying in 1940, it entered service in late 1942. Initially deemed unsuitable for carrier operations due to poor visibility and tricky handling, the Marines took it to land bases in the South Pacific. There, it became legendary, one of the fastest and most powerful fighters in the Pacific.
Eventually, carrier qualification issues were solved, and the Corsairs served aboard carriers as well, continuing in service long after the war ended. Bombers. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is perhaps the most iconic American aircraft of World War II. First flying in 1935, by 1941 it represented the cutting edge of heavy bomber design. With 4 powerful engines, bristling with defensive machine guns, and capable of carrying substantial bomb loads to distant targets, it embodied American strategic bombing doctrine. Over Europe, vast formations of hundreds of B-17s would drone through flak-filled skies, maintaining formation even as fighters attacked and shells burst around them. The Fortress earned its name through incredible toughness. Aircraft with catastrophic damage somehow brought their crews home. The 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign was built on the B-17's broad wings. Next up, the consolidated B-24 Liberator. This bomber actually surpassed the B-17 in production numbers. More B-24s were built than any other American aircraft during the war. First flying in 1939, it featured a distinctive twin-tail design and high-mounted wing. It could carry more bombs farther than the B-17, though it was less forgiving to fly and couldn't absorb quite as much battle damage. Liberators bombed Ploiești's oil fields in Romania, flew patrols over the Atlantic hunting U-boats, and pounded Japanese positions across the Pacific. It served in every theater, performing every mission asked of it. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was a technological marvel that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. First flying in 1942, it was the most advanced bomber of the war. Pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, massive range, and enormous bomb load. It was also incredibly expensive and complex. Designed specifically to strike Japan from distant bases, B-29s began their campaign in 1944, initially with high-altitude precision bombing, later with devastating low-level incendiary raids that burned Japanese cities. On August 6 and August 9, 1945, B-29s named Enola Gay and Boxcar delivered atomic weapons that ended the war.
Moving on, the Douglas B-18 Bolo was a pre-war medium bomber derived from the DC-2 airliner. First flying in 1935, it served as the Army Air Corps' primary bomber before the B-17 arrived in numbers. By 1941, it was obviously obsolete, too slow and vulnerable for combat against modern fighters. The Bolo was quickly relegated to coastal patrol, submarine hunting, and transport duties, where its load-carrying capacity remained useful. The Douglas B-23 Dragon was an improved version of the B-18, featuring more powerful engines and refined aerodynamics. First flying in 1939, only a small number were built before production shifted to more capable designs. Like the B-18, it saw little combat, serving primarily as a high-speed executive transport, shuttling commanders and important cargo across the continental United States. Next up, the Martin B-26 Marauder earned a grim nickname early in its career, Widowmaker. First flying in 1940, it featured short wings and required high landing speeds that intimidated inexperienced pilots. Early accidents were frequent, but once pilots mastered its demanding characteristics, the Marauder became one of the war's most effective and survivable medium bombers. It flew missions in every theater, and by war's end, it had earned the lowest loss rate of any American bomber. The North American B-25 Mitchell achieved immortality in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 of them off the aircraft carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo. First flying in 1940, this twin-engine medium bomber proved incredibly versatile. It could perform high-level precision bombing, skip bombing against shipping, and low-level strafing runs with forward-firing guns.
In the Pacific, heavily modified gunship versions with up to 18 forward-firing machine guns massacred Japanese shipping and ground targets. The Mitchell served with distinction in every theater and with numerous Allied air forces. The Lockheed Ventura was developed from the civilian Lodestar transport. First flying in 1941, it served primarily with the Royal Air Force for patrol and bombing missions over Europe. The U.S. Navy also operated it as a patrol bomber, where its range and payload made it useful for anti-submarine and reconnaissance missions over coastal waters. The Douglas A-20 Havoc was nimble, fast, and devastatingly effective. First flying in 1938 and entering service before America entered the war, it was one of the conflict's most successful light attack bombers. Its speed made it difficult to intercept. In the night intruder role, it prowled behind enemy lines, destroying trains, trucks, and airfields. As a ground strafer, its forward-firing guns tore up enemy positions. It served extensively in every theater with American, British, and Soviet forces.
The Douglas A-24 Banshee was the Army Air Force's version of the Navy's famous SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Operating from land bases in the Dutch East Indies and Philippines in early 1942, A-24s faced overwhelming Japanese forces without fighter escort. They suffered devastating losses, proving that dive bombers without air superiority were extremely vulnerable. Survivors were withdrawn from combat and relegated to training and coastal patrol. Next up, the Douglas A-26 Invader arrived late but made an immediate impact. First flying in 1942 and entering service in 1944, it was fast enough to outrun many fighters while carrying devastating firepower and bomb loads. Its speed, versatility, and heavy armament made it one of the war's best ground attack aircraft. Unlike most wartime aircraft, the Invader's design was so sound it remained in service through Korea and even Vietnam. The Martin Maryland was a light attack bomber supplied primarily to France and Great Britain under pre-war contracts. First flying in 1939, French aircraft saw brief service during the Battle of France. British Marylands operated extensively in North Africa and the Mediterranean, where their speed and range proved valuable for reconnaissance and attack missions against Axis forces. The Martin Baltimore was an evolution of the Maryland with improvements based on combat experience. First flying in 1941, this tough, reliable aircraft served extensively with British and Commonwealth forces, particularly in the harsh conditions of the Mediterranean theater. South African, British, and Australian squadrons flew it throughout the North African campaign and into Italy. Next up, the North American A-36 Apache was a fascinating variant, essentially a P-51 Mustang modified as a dive bomber. Fitted with dive brakes and bomb racks, it entered service in 1942 and saw extensive use in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Once air superiority was established and the need for tactical bombing decreased, many were converted back to fighter configuration. The Northrop A-17 was a sturdy pre-war monoplane attack aircraft. First flying in 1935, it represented an improvement over earlier biplane attack aircraft, but by 1941 it was rapidly obsolete. Most served as advanced trainers, teaching pilots and gunners before they transitioned to frontline aircraft. The Vultee Vengeance was a dedicated two-seat dive bomber. Though American-designed and built, it saw its most extensive use with the Royal Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. First flying in 1941, it provided close air support in the Burma campaign, where its accuracy against point targets proved valuable in jungle warfare. The Curtiss CB-2C Helldiver earned the unfortunate nickname the Beast. Designed to replace the beloved Dauntless, it first flew in 1940 but didn't enter service until late 1943. Initial versions were plagued by poor handling characteristics, structural problems, and reliability issues. Pilots hated it. Engineers gradually fixed most problems, and by war's end, it had matured into a capable dive bomber, though it never earned the affection the Dauntless inspired.
Next up, the Douglas SBD Dauntless. This aircraft changed the course of the Pacific War. First flying in 1938 and entering Navy service in 1940, it was already considered somewhat obsolete by Pearl Harbor. But at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, SBD dive bomber pilots sent 4 Japanese fleet carriers to the bottom in a matter of minutes, delivering blows from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. Its stability as a dive-bombing platform allowed pinpoint accuracy. Pilots trusted it completely. It served throughout the war, reliable and deadly until finally replaced by the Helldiver. The Douglas TBD Devastator holds a tragic place in history. First flying in 1935, it was the Navy's first carrier-based monoplane torpedo bomber, representing a significant advance when it entered service in 1937. But by 1942, it was painfully obsolete, slow, poorly defended, and with an unreliable torpedo. At the Battle of Midway, Devastator squadrons pressed home attacks against the Japanese fleet with extraordinary courage. They were slaughtered. Of 41 Devastators that attacked, 35 were shot down with minimal results. The survivors were immediately withdrawn and replaced. The Grumman TBF Avenger replaced the Devastator and proved everything its predecessor was not. First flying in 1941 and entering service in 1942, it was rugged, reliable, and carried a powerful torpedo or substantial bomb load. Future President George H.W. Bush flew one from the carrier USS San Jacinto. Avengers served with distinction throughout the Pacific War, participating in every major carrier battle. Their reliability and versatility made them essential to carrier air wings through war's end. Next up, the Vought SB-2U Vindicator was a pre-war scout bomber. First flying in 1936, by 1942 it was obsolete and served in limited numbers. Some participated at the Battle of Midway, where they attacked Japanese ships with minimal success. Quickly replaced by more modern dive bombers, the few remaining Vindicators finished the war as trainers. Patrol and flying boats. The Boeing 314 Clipper wasn't a combat aircraft, but it played a vital role. First flying in 1938, these magnificent flying boats represented the height of pre-war luxury air travel, crossing oceans in comfort. When war came, the military requisitioned them for long-distance transport, carrying commanders, diplomats, and vital cargo across the Atlantic and Pacific. President Roosevelt flew in one to the Casablanca Conference. Their range and reliability made them invaluable for establishing critical logistics routes. Next up, the consolidated PBY Catalina is perhaps the most beloved patrol aircraft ever built. First flying in 1935, this slow, rugged flying boat served with Allied forces worldwide throughout the war. Its extraordinary range allowed patrols deep over hostile waters. Catalina's hunted submarines in the Atlantic, spotted Japanese fleets in the Pacific, rescued downed air crews from shark-infested waters, and served as night harassment bombers, black cats, tormenting Japanese forces after dark. Pilots and crews loved it for its reliability and ability to bring them home even when badly damaged.
The consolidated PB-2Y Coronado was a much larger 4-engine flying boat. First flying in 1937, it was primarily used for long-range transport across the vast Pacific, moving critical personnel and cargo between islands. Its size and range made it valuable for logistics, though it never achieved the fame of its smaller sibling, the Catalina. Moving on, the consolidated PB-4Y2 Privateer was a Navy-specific evolution of the B-24 Liberator, optimized for maritime patrol. First flying in 1943, it featured a distinctive single vertical tail and modifications for long overwater missions. It hunted Japanese shipping and submarines in the Pacific, providing long-range reconnaissance and attack capabilities for the Navy. The Douglas Dolphin was a small, high-wing amphibian used mainly for coastal patrol and light utility transport early in the war.
First flying in 1930, small numbers served with the Coast Guard and Navy performing search and rescue and patrol missions along American coastlines. Next up, the Grumman J-2F Duck was a reliable utility biplane amphibian that served throughout the war. First flying in 1933, its ability to operate from water or land made it invaluable for air-sea rescue, coastal patrol, target towing, and general utility work. Many downed pilots owed their lives to duck crews who landed in dangerous waters to pull them to safety. The Grumman J-4F Widgeon was a smaller twin-engine amphibian. First flying in 1940, it served mainly as a light utility transport and anti-submarine patrol aircraft along U.S. coastlines, providing protection against the U-boat threat that brought the war to American shores in 1942. The Grumman JRF Goose was the larger predecessor to the Widgeon. First flying in 1937, this twin-engine amphibian proved highly successful as a utility transport with the military and Coast Guard. Its versatility and reliability made it popular for rescuing downed air crews and transporting personnel to locations without runways. Next up, the Hall PH was a large patrol flying boat used by the Coast Guard. Derived from earlier naval aircraft factory designs and first flying in 1929, it served throughout the early war years on patrol and anti-submarine missions before being replaced by more modern types. The Martin PBM Mariner was a twin-engine patrol bomber flying boat that became a mainstay of anti-submarine warfare. First flying in 1939, it was particularly essential in the Battle of the Atlantic, hunting German U-boats threatening Allied shipping. Its range, endurance, and weapons load made it one of the most effective submarine hunters of the war. The Naval Aircraft Factory N3N was the bright yellow biplane primary trainer that taught thousands of naval aviators their first lessons in flight. First flying in 1935, it was nicknamed Yellow Peril due to its color and the hazards of training. Rugged and forgiving, it survived countless student errors and served throughout the war as the Navy's primary trainer.
Transports and utility aircraft. The Beechcraft C-45 Expediter was the military version of the famous Model 18 light transport. First produced in 1937, it served reliably as a high-speed utility and liaison aircraft, moving commanders and small cargoes quickly across theater areas. Next up, the Budd RB-1 Conestoga was a unique transport aircraft built largely of stainless steel. First flying in 1943, it featured a large clamshell cargo door for easy loading of vehicles. Only a small number were produced, as aluminum aircraft proved more practical for wartime production. The Cessna C-165 Airmaster was a small, high-wing civilian aircraft pressed into military service as a light utility transport and liaison plane during the immediate wartime buildup. First flying in 1936, it served in small numbers before being replaced by purpose-built military types. The consolidated C-87 Liberator Express was a dedicated transport conversion of the B-24 bomber airframe. First flying in 1942, it was essential for long-range heavy logistics across the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. It could carry troops, cargo, or fuel across vast distances, though it retained some of the B-24's difficult handling characteristics. Moving on, the Curtiss C-46 Commando was a massive, powerful twin-engine transport. First flying in 1940, it was the largest and heaviest twin-engine aircraft used by the Allies. It became legendary flying the Hump, the dangerous route over the Himalayas from India to China, supplying Chinese forces and the B-29 bases that would eventually strike Japan. The Commando could carry enormous loads at high altitude, though it required skilled pilots. The Douglas C-32 was an early military version of the commercial DC-2 transport. First flying in 1934, small numbers of these pre-war airliners were impressed into military service when war came, providing transport until more modern types became available. Next up, the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the immortal DC-3 airliner. First flying in 1935, it became arguably the most important transport aircraft in history. Reliable, easy to maintain, capable of operating from rough strips, and able to carry substantial loads, it was absolutely crucial to Allied operations. C-47s dropped paratroopers over Normandy and Holland, towed gliders into combat, supplied isolated forces, evacuated wounded, and performed countless other missions. General Eisenhower called it one of the 4 tools most vital to Allied victory. The Douglas C-37 Skytrooper was a troop transport variant of the C-47. First flying in 1941, it featured bench seats for paratroopers but lacked the large rear cargo doors of the C-47, making it less versatile. Many were later converted to standard C-47 configuration. The Douglas C-54 Skymaster was a 4-engine transport that provided long-haul capabilities. First flying in 1938 as the commercial DC-4, military versions became essential for transatlantic routes, VIP transport, and major logistical movements. President Roosevelt flew in one to the Yalta Conference. Its range and capacity made it crucial for maintaining the flow of supplies and personnel across vast distances. Next up, the Fairchild Argus was the military designation for the civilian Fairchild F-24. First flying in 1932, it served primarily as a light transport and liaison aircraft for commanders in the European theater, providing quick movement between forward positions. The Howard G.H. was a light utility transport used by the Navy. Derived from a fast civilian racer aircraft and first flying in 1936, it provided high-speed communications and light transport for naval commanders. The Lockheed Electra was an elegant twin-engine airliner pressed into limited military service. First flying in 1934, it served as a transport and navigation trainer early in the conflict before being replaced by more capable military designs. Moving on, the Lockheed Lodestar was a larger, faster version of the Electra. First flying in 1939, it served extensively with the Royal Air Force and U.S. military as a fast utility transport, moving important personnel and cargo quickly across theaters. The Nordwind Norseman was a rugged, high-wing Canadian bush plane. First flying in 1935, it was adopted by the U.S. Army for transport and liaison duties, especially in difficult terrain, where its short-field capabilities and reliability proved invaluable. Next up, the Stinson Reliant was a high-wing monoplane often used for light transport, ambulance duties, and limited anti-submarine patrol roles. First flying in 1933, it served in various utility capacities throughout the war. Trainers. The Beechcraft AT-7 Navigator was a twin-engine advanced trainer. First flying in 1941, it was specifically designed to teach navigation and radio procedures to future bomber crews, with stations for student navigators and bombardiers. Next up, the Beechcraft AT-10 Wichita was a twin-engine trainer built primarily of wood to conserve vital wartime metals. First flying in 1941, it was used to transition pilots from single-engine trainers to the complexities of twin-engine operations. The Beechcraft AT-11 Kansan was another twin-engine trainer specifically equipped for bomb aiming and gunnery instruction for bomber crews. First flying in 1941, it allowed future bombardiers and gunners to practice their deadly skills.
The Boeing Stearman Model 75, commonly called simply the Stearman, was the primary biplane trainer for both the Army Air Force and Navy. First flying in 1934, its slow speed, forgiving flight characteristics, and rugged construction made it ideal for teaching the basics of flight to tens of thousands of future combat pilots. Moving on, the Cessna AT-17 Bobcat was a twin-engine advanced trainer.
First flying in 1939, it was known to pilots as the bamboo bomber because of its partial wooden construction, a necessity to conserve aluminum for combat aircraft. Next up, the Curtiss-Wright AT-9 Fledgling was a demanding twin-engine trainer designed to more closely simulate the handling of frontline twin-engine bombers. First flying in 1941, its challenging characteristics prepared pilots for the high-performance aircraft they would fly in combat. The Curtiss-Wright CW-21 was actually a lightweight fighter design that saw limited service, primarily with the Chinese and Dutch, rather than a U.S. trainer, though some were used for training purposes. The Fairchild BT-12 Sophomore was unique as the first military aircraft built entirely of stainless steel. First flying in 1942, this experiment in construction methods saw very limited service as a basic trainer before conventional aluminum designs proved more practical. The North American AT-6 Texan is perhaps the most famous advanced trainer of all time. First flying in 1935, it was used to hone the skills of virtually every Allied fighter pilot. Its performance closely approximated frontline fighters, allowing students to learn combat tactics, formation flying, and gunnery in a relatively safe environment. The distinctive sound of its engine became synonymous with pilot training. Moving on, the North American BT-9 was an early basic trainer that paved the way for the far more successful AT-6 Texan. First flying in 1935, it was used for initial combat tactics instruction before being superseded by improved designs.
Next up, the Ryan PT-22 Recruit was a popular low-wing primary trainer. First flying in 1939, its radial engine sound and reliable characteristics provided basic flight instruction for thousands of pilots learning their craft. The Vultee BT-13 Valiant was a rugged, fixed-gear basic trainer. First flying in 1939, it was nicknamed the Vultee Vibrator due to a slight instability in flight, but it proved essential for intermediate training, teaching students more advanced techniques before they moved to combat-type trainers. The Piper J-3 Cub formed the basis for the TG-8 training glider and various Liaison aircraft, and some were militarized as the O-59, though it wasn't designated PT-1. The PT-1 designation actually belonged to an older consolidated trainer from the 1920s. Liaison, Observation, and Reconnaissance. The Aeronautica L-3 Grasshopper was one of the simple high-wing light observation planes that proved invaluable in the war. First flying in 1941, it provided crucial artillery spotting and liaison duties, operating from primitive strips just behind the front lines. Next up, the Curtiss O-52 Owl was a high-wing observation monoplane built just before the war. First flying in 1940, it was quickly made obsolete by its slow speed and vulnerability, being relegated to coastal patrol and liaison duties. The Curtiss SC Seahawk was a late-war high-performance float plane designed to replace the Kingfisher. First flying in 1944, it was faster and more heavily armed than its predecessor. Though it entered service, it saw limited combat before VJ Day ended the war. The Curtiss SO-3C Seamew was intended to replace the Seagull. First flying in 1939, this scout observation float plane was plagued by instability and engine issues. It proved so problematic that it was quickly withdrawn from operational use, with crews preferring the older Seagull. Next up, the Interstate L-6 Grasshopper was a simple two-seat high-wing monoplane used for liaison and observation duties. First flying in 1941, it was a less common variation of the widespread Grasshopper design that served in similar roles. The North American O-47 was a large three-seat observation monoplane. First flying in 1935, by the war's start, it was obsolete. It saw brief use in coastal patrol before being relegated to training duties. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper was the most famous of the light observation planes.
First flying as the civilian J-3 Cub in 1937 and militarized in 1941, it became essential for low-level reconnaissance and artillery fire direction right on the front lines. Unarmed and vulnerable, L-4 pilots flew with extraordinary courage, directing devastating artillery fire onto enemy positions. Next up, the Piper L-14 Army cruiser was a slightly larger version of the L-4 Grasshopper, though actually the military designation appears to be incorrect. The L-14 was not a standard designation. Most larger Piper Liaison aircraft were designated in the L-18 series. The Stinson L-1 Vigilant was designed for short-field takeoff and landing. First flying in 1940, this high-wing observation aircraft provided reconnaissance and utility transport in rugged forward conditions during the early war years. Moving on, the Stinson L-5 Sentinel was known as the Flying Jeep. First flying in 1942, this dependable liaison aircraft was used for flying personnel and evacuating wounded from small improvised fields. Its reliability and versatility made it beloved by frontline troops. Next up, the Taylor-Craft L-2 Grasshopper was another crucial member of the light observation fleet. First flying in 1941, it was often used for reconnaissance and command transport right behind the front lines, braving enemy fire to provide essential support. The Vogt OS-2U Kingfisher was the quintessential ship-based floatplane. First flying in 1938, it was durable and essential for air-sea rescue and spotting roles throughout the entire conflict. Launched by catapult from battleships and cruisers, Kingfisher pilots rescued downed aviators from hostile waters, spotted for naval gunfire, and performed reconnaissance. Its reliability and versatility made it invaluable to the fleet. Gliders. The Waco CG-4A Hadrian was the most famous and widely used American transport glider. First flying in 1942, it could carry 15 troops or a jeep and small howitzer for airborne assault. Towed behind C-47s and released over the target, Hadrian gliders delivered troops behind enemy lines during D-Day, Market Garden, and the Rhine crossing. Fragile and defenseless once released, glider pilots demonstrated extraordinary bravery delivering their cargo despite withering ground fire. Next up, the Leister-Kaufmann TG-4 was a tandem-seat training glider. First flying in 1942, it was used to teach future cargo glider pilots the delicate art of unpowered flight and landing, preparing them for the dangerous missions they would fly in combat gliders. Helicopters. The Sikorsky R-4 Hoverfly was the world's first mass-produced helicopter. First flying in 1942, it saw limited service for reconnaissance and rescue, demonstrating the potential of rotary wing flight technology. Though primitive by later standards, it proved the concept and saved lives. Moving on, the Sikorsky R-5 was a more powerful two-seat helicopter intended for utility and rescue work. First flying in 1943, it represented a significant step up in capability from the earlier R-4, with improved performance and payload. Next up, the Sikorsky R-6 was an improved version of the R-4, designed to be faster and more stable. First flying in 1943, it was used primarily for observation and liaison roles in the late war, continuing to prove the value of rotary wing aircraft. Drones and pilotless aircraft. The Culver PQ-8 was a radio-controlled target drone used extensively to train anti-aircraft gunners. First flying in 1941, it represented an early step in autonomous flight development, allowing gunners to practice against realistic moving aerial targets without risking manned aircraft. Next up, the Culver PQ-14 was a larger, faster, and more advanced radio-controlled target than the PQ-8. First flying in 1942, it improved the realism of essential anti-aircraft training, better simulating the speed and maneuverability of enemy aircraft. The Interstate TDR was an early naval radio-controlled assault drone. First flying in 1942, these primitive flying bombs were tested for use against heavily defended Japanese targets. The concept was sound, delivering explosive payloads without risking aircrew, but the technology wasn't quite mature enough for reliable operational use during the war. Each of these aircraft, from the legendary to the forgotten, played its part in the greatest conflict humanity has ever known. They were tools of war, but they were also lifelines, carrying wounded soldiers home, delivering supplies to starving populations, and evacuating refugees from burning cities. They were flown by young men, most barely out of their teens, who climbed into cockpits knowing each mission might be their last. Some of these aircraft achieved immortality in the history books. Others served quietly, their contributions known only to those they saved or supported. Together, they formed the vast aerial armada that helped turn the tide of history. The roar of their engines has long since faded, but their legacy endures, a testament to the courage of those who flew them and the ingenuity of those who built them in humanity's darkest hour.